You know, if governments are hiding something and they don't know, or they don't want us to know about it, there's probably a good reason why we should know about it. You know, it's like all of us in this room tonight, we're all interested in the subject, we're all on the same level, we all want answers, we just want to know what's going on. And if there are people in government who do know what's going on, or at least have a good idea, and they have at least some hard data to back up their beliefs, etc., then I don't see why we should be kept in the dark. That's why I go poking my nose in where it's probably not wanted. So, but hence what I'm going to be talking about tonight.
What the fuck?
What I'm going to talk about tonight is a subject that I guess is kind of a strange one that most people don't really have much of an awareness of, and I didn't have much of an awareness of until I started to dig into it. Now, we all know, of course, that over the years, agencies like the CIA, FBI, Air Force, they've all looked into the UFO phenomenon, but pretty much from the modern era, the 1940s onwards. But until I started to dig into this further, I didn't realize the sheer extent to which agencies had literally delved into things like the pyramids, Noah's Ark, the Dead Sea Scrolls, things like this. And of course, this begs a couple of questions. What is so significant about these events that attracts government interest? And why should the government be interested in the first place? You know, you would imagine archaeological mysteries would be something for archaeologists or historians or theologians, not for the finest minds in the Pentagon. And so I guess the battle was on for me to try and figure out what was going on and why. And to give you some sort of background as to how and why I do this sort of research that chiefly sort of focuses on what governments know about UFOs and related topics. My father was in the British Royal Air Force and he worked on radar. He was a radar mechanic. And he was involved in several UFO incidents back in 1952 at the height of a NATO exercise called Mainbrace. And my dad was stationed at a base on the east coast of England called RAF Neatishead. And over the course of 3 or 4 nights in September 52, the radar personnel who were on duty reported tracking on the radar scopes these high-flying, fast-moving objects that nobody seemed to know what they were. But the first thought was, well, you know, it's the height of the Cold War, so it's got to be the Russians. You know, they've got to be launching some sneak attack or testing the defences of the nation to see if we could withstand an attack. So aircraft were scrambled from a nearby Air Force base, and the pilots reported seeing these. They didn't describe them as like classic flying saucers. They described seeing these very brightly lit objects. You kind of imagine a camera flash, where when you see a camera flash, you know, you get this huge sort of silver bright light, and then it goes away. Well, if you imagine a camera flash that just doesn't stop flashing, you know, it's just there all the time. That was the intensity of what they were seeing. But as the guys were tracking these objects on the radar, and as the planes were scrambled to intercept them, they clearly reacted to the presence of the aircraft, and the ground personnel who were working the radar said that as the planes approached them, the objects would shoot away at high speed and kind of play like a game of cat and mouse with them, where there was no outright hostility, but they would literally sort of play left and right hand turns and, as I said, cat and mouse type experiences, as if to sort of test, if you like, the extent to which our aircraft could potentially engage them in some sort of combat. Now, this went on for about 3 days and 3 nights. And there was never any outright hostility, and literally on every occasion all the aircraft were forced to return to base because they were just running out of fuel. They just couldn't stay up in the sky anymore. You know, if they did stay any longer, they'd just sort of fall down into the English Channel. And at the end of these encounters, everybody who was involved, from the radar mechanics like my dad, the radar operators, the pilots, the ground personnel, everybody was reminded of the fact that they'd signed the British government's Official Secrets Act. And the Official Secrets Act, anybody who works in the government has to sign this. And it basically prevents you from speaking about things that might have an effect on national security when you leave the job. So, in other words, it's from the government's perspective, it's like a protective piece of legislation to keep you quiet, if you like. So when he told me this story, it got me interested for 2 reasons. One, because it was my own father, and that, you know, I trusted him and knew that he had a background in the military. But that was the second reason as well. He had this standing and training as a radar mechanic, and of course radar personnel are trained and taught to know the difference between an aircraft, a helicopter. A lot of people don't know that a very tightly packed flock of birds can actually be picked up on a radar screen. But radar operators are trained to know the difference between these different phenomena, and they can tell a solid object from, you know, an object that is just a mass of birds or whatever. So when he related this to me, I was like, wow, you know, not only do UFOs exist, but it seems that government agencies around the world, and certainly in Britain, they seem to know something about the subjects, but they were trying to keep it under wraps and ensure that nobody was sort of out of the military was going to find out about these cases. And I always think that, you know, if governments are hiding something and they don't know, or they don't want us to know about it, there's probably a good reason why we should know about it. And so that has always been my approach, has been that I don't feel personally that government agencies have the right to decide who should know about what potentially could be one of the most important matters facing the human race. You know, why should 10, 20 or 30 people have the right to make that decision? And I think, you know, it's like all of us in this room tonight, we're all interested in the subject, we're all on the same level, we all want answers, we all, you know, have our different theories and ideas. We just want to know what's going on. And if there are people in governments who do know what's going on, or at least have a good idea, and they have at least some hard data to back up their beliefs, etc., then I don't see why we should be kept in the dark. So that's why I go poking my nose in where it's probably not wanted. So, my background is in journalism. I still do a lot of regular, normal journalism today, but I left school, I lived in England until 2001. I live in Dallas now. But I left school in 1982, which is kind of scary, 31 years ago. I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I wasn't the best student, but I got a job working on a music magazine, a rock music magazine back in England, and did that for a few years. And found I enjoyed working as a journalist. Sort of every day was a little bit different. And after a few years, I thought, well, why not try and combine the interest in UFOs and paranormal, etc., Bigfoot, with investigative journalism. So that's what I've tried to do, is apply regular investigative journalistic techniques that you would use in any situation. You know, if you're doing a story for a newspaper where there's been a local murder in the area or a car accident, you know, investigate this phenomena in exactly the same way and try and gather data, on the record witness testimony, government files and so on. So that's what I've tried to do over the years, and then present the data for people to see. And I always think it's important to present the data as you see it or as you collect it, but not to sort of force feed a particular belief system down people's throats, because, you know, as I said, we're all in this together, you know, but just because I've written books doesn't mean I have any more answers than somebody else who doesn't write books, you know. I don't have much time for this sort of ego-driven angle of, oh, I'm an author, you know, so I'm right. No, all I can do is sort of put the data out for people to see what I found and share it with people, because, as I said, we're all on the same level, we're all looking for answers. And I don't believe in force-feeding my views or conclusions. I prefer to share the data and see if anybody else can then, you know, back it up or come up with their own scenarios that may bolster it or may not. You know, I think the thing we always need to remember still with UFO is that the U still stands for unidentified. You know, we know there's a phenomenon, but is it extraterrestrial? Is it interdimensional? You know, we just really don't know. All we know for sure is that there's something interacting with us that, you know, doesn't come from around here. And so in that sense, I think, from my perspective, the responsible thing to do is sort of share with you the data and the theories and scenarios I've been able to put together, and hopefully, you know, we can have some insights as to what's going on the various topics under consideration. And tonight, as I said, it's going to be a book I had out in 2011 called The Pyramids and the Pentagon. Now, the whole issue behind this book, as I said, is how, why, and for how long, and to what extent government agencies have taken an interest in the mysteries of the past. Now, when I say government agencies, the best way I can describe it, if you kind of imagine Indiana Jones type characters working for the CIA and traveling around the world and investigating things like the Ark of the Covenant and the Holy Grail and stuff like that, that is literally the scenario we're seeing. You know, we're kind of, I guess, used to, we think of the CIA and intelligence agencies, and we think of espionage missions behind the old Iron Curtain at the height of the Cold War, you know, spying on the Russians. We don't necessarily think of people sitting in CIA headquarters poring over the Dead Sea Scrolls. But that is actually literally what we are seeing. So, you know, we're delving into very strange, almost like fringe-like territory, that really doesn't fall into one particular category or domain. You know, it's very hard to understand why this is going on. And I'll be the first to admit that a lot of the research that I've uncovered is pretty much still in its early stages because so much of it is so new. You know, if you think of Roswell today, for example, everybody knows about the Roswell case. We imagine 34 years ago when Stan Friedman and Bill Moore started doing research into it, and it was in its infancy. It was very much new territory, and that's kind of like with this, that we're seeing doors starting to open, we're seeing a few files beginning to surface, and we're putting the strands together, showing that, as I said, in the same way that from the 40s onwards, the government heavily investigated UFO reports, they had this other, arguably even sort of more covert and secret program to dig into the mysteries of the past. And the more data that I've been able to find, I've been able to come up with what I think is the probable reason why they're looking into these mysteries. And it has nothing to do with archaeology or furthering our knowledge of the history of the human race. That is sort of, they have answered some of those questions, but that's sort of a byproduct to the reason why they're doing the research, which I'll make clear to you. One of the interesting legends that surrounds the construction of Stonehenge, which is something I'll talk about shortly in relation to the government aspect of things, is the theory that they were moved by what today we would call anti-gravity or levitation. Now, the people who used Stonehenge for various ceremonies going back sort of 4,000 or 5,000 years, and there was actually an original settlement there before that goes back about 9,000 years. They have legends and stories about how magicians would tap the stones and they would sort of rise slowly into the air, and they could be pushed very lightly and gently, kind of like, imagine like a rowing boat on the water. You just push it along and it would move with the tide. And that's a story they have connected to Stonehenge. Now, you could say, well, that's just a classic fairy tale or a bit of folklore. But as I'll point out later, we find similar stories all over the place, from Egypt to South America to ancient Rome and ancient Greece. They all have these stories about the stones being moved by something along the lines of levitation. And this sort of got me interested, and I started doing research into a lot of these sort of folkloric legends around the world about how these massive stones were supposedly moved by very alternative means. And when I began digging into that, that's when I first stumbled on this angle that the government was looking into that as well. And that was one thing I never expected to find. You know, I chiefly thought I was going to uncover old documents and, parchments and that sort of thing that somebody had written 3,000 or 4,000 years ago, not to find actual government records on the feasibility of moving stones via something like levitation, which is actually what I did uncover. So that's what set me off, was this sort of research into Stonehenge, and the government angle was a byproduct of doing that research. Now, as far as I've been able to determine at least, the earliest involvement of the US government in ancient mysteries began in 1947 with the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, the Dead Sea Scrolls, they're called the Dead Sea Scrolls because they were discovered on the Dead Sea, surprise, surprise, and at a place called Qumran in a series of caves. And they were discovered in 1947. And they're on wide public display today. Anybody can go and see them. But in 1947, well, it was a very interesting year, 1947. You had the Roswell incident. You had Kenneth Arnold's famous UFO encounter that led to the creation of the term flying saucer. 1947 was also the year that the CIA was formed, and it was the same year that the Dead Sea Scrolls were found on the Dead Sea. Now, when the CIA was created, they basically carried on the work of two previous intelligence groups, one of which existed in the Second World War and one post-war. One was called the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, and the other one was called the Central Intelligence Group. And when the CIA was established, they basically offered jobs to all the guys who had previously been in those two organisations, said, hey, do you want to come on board for this new group we're setting up? And of course a lot of them said, yeah, sure. And one of those who did that was a guy named Miles Copeland. And Miles Copeland had been involved in the US intelligence community way back to the Second World War. And he spent a lot of time in the Middle East, specifically in Damascus. And he headed up the CIA office in Damascus, which operated out of the American embassy in the city as well. And just as an aside, this has nothing to do with it, but Miles Copeland, the chief CIA officer in Damascus, was the father of Stuart Copeland, who was the drummer in the Police. I say it's got nothing to do with with the story. I just thought it's just like one of those weird little things that I uncovered doing the research. So maybe Stuart knows a few secrets. Who knows? But anyway, his dad, Miles Copeland, as I said, he ran the CIA office out of Damascus, and many years after he retired, we're talking 1947, he went public, I think it was like early 90s, he spoke about how one particular day somebody came to the embassy, and it was a guy who was described as dressed in like a flowing Bedouin type outfit and carrying some sort of package, and said to the person at the front desk, I need to see someone and speak to somebody about an important matter. And so they referred him to Miles Copeland, who took the guy up into his office and said, what's it all about? And this character sort of, almost like an over-dramatic, mysterious fashion, opened up this package, and out came tumbling something like, very much like the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, as I said, the acknowledged Dead Sea Scrolls are on public display today. You can go and see them. They're in a museum. But this particular scroll, which clearly seems to have been one of the original scrolls, obviously didn't make it to the public display. What happened was that it was shown to Miles Copeland, and the guy said to him, I need somebody to translate it. This is an important find. Can you help me? And, Copeland, he'd worked and lived there for a long time, but he certainly wasn't an expert in ancient Middle Eastern languages. But he had a friend and a colleague who was, a guy named Kermit Roosevelt, who did he wasn't an employee of the CIA, but he did a lot of contract research for the CIA and worked for them. So Copeland basically said to this guy, well, yeah, I've got this friend, he can research this, whatever this document is, whatever it says, do you want to come back and then we can give you the answers? And that apparently satisfied the guy, and he just kind of, again, sort of overly mysteriously vanished out the door, and he literally never did come back. It was almost like he wanted to offload this particular scroll, but did so under the guise of wanting answers and promising to come back. So Miles Copeland copied one by one the pages. He just photographed them all and printed off large-scale photographs, sent them to Kermit Roosevelt for analysis. And what happened then was that for some weird reason, that particular scroll became subject to a CIA classified order. That's to say that one of these ancient parchments from however many thousands of years ago entered the CIA, and somebody said, there's something significant about this, and they essentially put a top secret stamp on it. Now, this surprised even Miles Copeland, because like most of us, his first thought is, well, why on earth would the CIA have not just an interest in the scroll, they might want to look at it to try and decipher it for this guy, but why on earth would it then become a matter of national security? That didn't seem to make any sense at all. So he tried to find out more about it and could not get any answers. He never saw the scroll again. He never saw the photographs again. For all intents and purposes, the story was just as dead and buried as the scrolls had been for thousands of years. And it kind of mystified him, and he didn't really do anything else with it, because what else could he do? And so he just relegated it to one of those weird experiences that occurred during the course of his CIA career. Now, he did hear rumours that the scroll in question supposedly was a very early written version of what eventually became in the Bible, the book of Daniel. And supposedly it related to a lot of things like strange dreams and prophecies and trying to forecast the future and things like this on the part of Daniel. And what's interesting is that, regardless of whether people take these stories literally or not, it was in this very same time period that the CIA began its very early research into things like remote viewing and psychic spying. So I think we can make an argument that if we look at the time frame when the CIA was researching things like ESP and prophecy and psychic spying and things like that, to get hold of an ancient document that actually talked about these very things, but from the perspective of Daniel in the book of Daniel, I think they possibly translated that ancient book to try and give them some sort of understanding of the power of the human mind, because there were clearly parallels between this ancient text and what the CIA was working on in terms of what eventually became its so-called remote viewing program. So what we're seeing here is probably the earliest example of why intelligence agencies have taken an interest in the mysteries of the past, and it's because where there's some sort of military potential or military capital gain, if you like. So, it isn't so much about furthering our knowledge of archaeology, of history, of the Bible, or any, Middle Eastern religion. It's about, is there some sort of value we can learn or gain from studying these phenomena that we could turn into like a military objective, if you like. I hope that's sort of given you a few indications and ideas as to the history of how and why government agencies have looked into the ancient past and why they've done it, and how it also opens doors for a lot of secret history or lost history about our own civilization, that if that surfaces as well, which it may well do if these agencies have files on that also, which may well, if that surfaces, could potentially give us profound data and profound shocks as well in regard to our history as a civilization and the perils we might need to look for in the future to ensure that we don't go the same way potentially as some of these master societies that came before us, if you like. So thanks very much, and if anybody's got any questions, I'll be pleased to answer them.
What the fuck?
You know, if governments are hiding something and they don't know, or they don't want us to know about it, there's probably a good reason why we should know about it. You know, it's like all of us in this room tonight, we're all interested in the subject, we're all on the same level, we all want answers, we just want to know what's going on. And if there are people in government who do know what's going on, or at least have a good idea, and they have at least some hard data to back up their beliefs, etc., then I don't see why we should be kept in the dark. That's why I go poking my nose in where it's probably not wanted. So, but hence what I'm going to be talking about tonight.
What the fuck? What the fuck?
What I'm going to talk about tonight is a subject that I guess is kind of a strange one that most people don't really have much of an awareness of, and I didn't have much of an awareness of until I started to dig into it. Now, we all know, of course, that over the years, agencies like the CIA, FBI, Air Force, they've all looked into the UFO phenomenon, but pretty much from the modern era, the 1940s onwards. But until I started to dig into this further, I didn't realize the sheer extent to which agencies had literally delved into things like the pyramids, Noah's Ark, the Dead Sea Scrolls, things like this. And of course, this begs a couple of questions. What is so significant about these events that attracts government interest? And why should the government be interested in the first place? You know, you would imagine archaeological mysteries would be something for archaeologists or historians or theologians, not for the finest minds in the Pentagon. And so I guess the battle was on for me to try and figure out what was going on and why. And to give you some sort of background as to how and why I do this sort of research that chiefly sort of focuses on what